breaking and entering, drunk and disorderly, law and order. A former prosecutor and a defence lawyer, not your typical pairing. And the result? Conversations about crime and punishment that are guaranteed to get you thinking.
Welcome to Justice Matters, a weekly podcast. Our episodes are available every Monday on Apple Podcast, Spotify and YouTube. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok. Enjoy the episode. This episode contains offences of violence, including murder. Listener discretion is advised.
Good morning, Joe.
Hello, Lizzie. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
Oh, I'm well.
That's good. I have a question for you.
Yes.
Do you think we have a youth crime crisis?
Loaded question. I think my answer to that is that there is youth crime offences are certainly up. Yes, in Queensland. And I say that's a policing problem. Yes.
Okay. So, I think, honestly, anyone who watches the news or reads the news at all would know that for the last few years there's been a real narrative, true or not, factual or not, about youth crime.
Yes.
And it's something that I have quite mixed feelings about. But it made me start thinking, do we actually have an increase in youth crime? And then I went down my usual rabbit holes.
Yes.
And there's been discussions in recent years about should we be raising the age of criminal responsibility?
Yes.
And what would that mean?
Yes.
And then, there's been official reports and statistics that, it's one group of recidivist serious offenders rather than a general increase. So I looked into all of this and I think one of the first things that, seems to come up a lot in official reports is that, yes, there is a lot of juvenile crime, but it's mostly property offences or stealing and that sort of thing. And I thought that doesn't, correlate with what I read in the media, you know? And so I had a little look. And I want to say from the outset, juvenile crime, I think, is very complex because often the kids who are committing offences have had disadvantaged upbringings.
Yes.
I think there is no doubt that, not all kids, there are kids who just choose to do the wrong thing, 100%. But there is also a lot of evidence that for a lot of the kids, particularly the very young kids, there is a lack of supervision or care or problems in the home or whatever it might be. And so I feel like in a way that's not their fault that they have gone down this path. But then I also think everyone has a choice. So I do feel very conflicted.
Okay.
So I looked at some cases of young offenders that are not just property offending to see, do we really need to be dealing with this? And part of it is because when we talk about this idea of raising the age of criminal responsibility, so, you would know at the moment kids from the age of 10 can potentially be charged with criminal offences. There's things that have to be satisfied, but 10-year-olds and up can be charged. But
so that means, just so we're clear, so if you're a 9-year-old and you're caught committing an offence, even if you're caught red-handed, you are not charged with a criminal offence.
That's right.
Yeah.
But the people who are saying we should raise the age of criminal responsibility to something like 14 say that kids between the ages of 10 and 14 aren't committing serious offences.
Yep.
And so I thought, well, is that actually true?
Yeah.
So I had a little look.
Yeah.
And sadly, I've got a lot of cases in recent years, starting from 2021, of really heinous crimes.
Sorry, but is that the justification for raising the age, that kids between 10 and 14 really aren't committing serious crimes, so why don't we just raise it to 14? So, and just so I understand, does that mean that if this law comes in, if you're an 11-year-old and you're caught committing, you could not be charged with an offence?
That's right. So maybe we should start with that.
Yeah.
So that presumption where if you're 9,
yes,
you cannot be charged. This is called Dolly Incapax.
Yes.
And it's present in all Australian jurisdictions.
Yes.
It's an international idea as well, that there is an age under which you cannot be charged.
Yes.
And so for Queensland, it's 10. For most of Australia, it's always been 10 as well.
Yes.
We're going to talk about the fact there are some reforms coming in.
I
know you
wouldn't
don't
talk
believe
about
me.
them. No, I'm not sure you should call them reforms. There are some changes coming in. I'm not sure they're reforms. They're changes to the law. Reform to me connotes that there's some improvement.
Oh, okay. Semantics.
Okay,
all right.
Sure.
But the international standard for the age of criminal responsibility in 2019 was emphasised as at least 14 years old, that no child, in terms of international standards, they encourage all countries who are signatories to the rights of the child to have an age of criminal responsibility of not less than 14.
Okay, so when you say that's the international standard, do you mean that this is what the United Nations is suggesting that countries do?
So the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child said this in 2019.
Yes.
And
why did they say that?
Well, they said, so previously it had been 12, their recommendation, but they're now encouraging state parties to take note of recent scientific findings and to increase the minimum age to 14 because the current research in child development and neuroscience provides evidence that the capacity for abstract reasoning is not fully developed in children under the age of 14. So we've always said that we acknowledge that any offender will be deemed a young offender until the age of 25 because we know that the brain doesn't fully develop until then.
And what effect does that have on what they're punished in terms of their punishment?
So the younger the offender,
the
more likely their prospects for rehabilitation will be good. And so they're given a degree of leniency by courts for being young. They can't reason the same way. They're not making the same rational choices. They don't have the life experience or maturity.
So young people, the young and stupid, as it were, so they're given that kind of leniency, but also because they're young, so they've got more opportunity, more likelihood of rehabilitation.
That's right. And so now they're saying, well, not only do we have problems with not having a fully developed brain till 25, the UN is saying, well, under the age of 14, they don't have the ability for abstract reasoning. So the choices they make shouldn't apply.
I must say I'm always a bit skeptical about what the UN says, but yes, okay.
All right. And so then I thought, okay, well, do we have kids under the age of 14 committing these kinds of heinous crimes?
Okay, but those two, in my mind, those two propositions don't necessarily sit together.
Okay, no. So my train of thought is that I think that for minor offences, for kids who get in trouble with graffiti or willful damage or stealing, whatever, between the ages of 10 and 14, I think there is an opportunity for different kinds of ways of dealing with that kind of petty offending. That doesn't necessarily have to involve the criminal justice system. But if these kids under the age of 14 are committing serious offences that involve violence against others, or, what we see so much of, this stealing of cars and then crashing them or burning them or driving dangerously or whatever it might be, where the potential for harm is so great, then I think, what do we do if we're not holding them criminally responsible? And so...
But the effect of that is what they go off to jail.
Well, I'm not saying... I mean, the punishment is a sentencing issue. My issue is, should they be brought into the criminal justice system at that young age? So I did have a little look, and not all of these cases relate to kids under the age of 14, but I think this is important to have this sort of understanding of the types of high-profile juvenile offending that has caught the public, and created this sense of unease and dissatisfaction with how juveniles are being dealt with. So I started with a very famous case. This was from Australia Day 2021, and it was Matthew Field, Kate Ledbetter, and their unborn child, Miles, who were killed when they were struck by a stolen car that sped through a red light while they were walking their dogs. So the offender at that time was 17. So he wasn't a very young offender in our context. He did get 10 years imprisonment, which was massive for a juvenile because 10 years is the maximum unless it's a particularly heinous crime. He had a 6-year non-parole period also, which is unusual because it's more than the halfway point. Now, the reason I included this one is because at the time that he killed that couple, he was on bail for other offences, and he had been before the Children's Court 7 times for a total of 107 charges.
Wow. Okay.
So he was not a new visitor to the criminal justice system. And there was a consequence from his case being that breach of bail became an offence for a juvenile offender. Which caused a lot of outrage.
Okay, but let's just explain that. So if you're an adult and you're on bail and you commit another offence, you are liable to be charged not only with the other offence you've committed, but with the offence of breaching bail, which is a criminal offence in itself.
That's right.
And so juveniles were never charged with that. Wasn't available, or they were just never charged?
It was not a charge.
It was not a charge. So now it is a charge.
Yes.
And so they can be punished for the breach as well as for whatever else they did.
Yes.
Okay.
So that offence was committed in 2021. It wasn't until 2023 that that legislative change came in.
Got it.
All right. So that was the first one. Then there was a fellow, Michael Warburton, who was 59. He was driving his Vespa scooter home, September 2022, and a stolen car crossed to the wrong side of the road and mowed him down. So the boy who was driving was 15. So again, not under that age, but very young.
We're moving in that direction.
And there was a girl in the car as well. She was 16, and they allegedly ran from the car, left him on the ground with critical injuries, and he died later that night in hospital.
What? Sorry, is there some?
What?
What's the issue of them running from the car? I mean, that you're not obliged to render assistance to an injured person.
Well, no, but if they had called or stemmed the blood, like who knows?
Sure.
Maybe he wouldn't have died. I don't know.
Okay.
I just think it's another level of callousness.
Might be just they're afraid of getting caught and they don't really think about him.
Which is selfish and callous.
Okay. I'm not sure I'd say callous, but you could say selfish, I suppose.
So they were charged with dangerous operation of a motor vehicle causing death, which we've talked about that charge a lot. Other charges as well. And they got convicted. Now, what I thought was interesting from this case was that the wife of the victim said that she held no anger towards those kids. She said, "Am I mad at the kids involved? No, I'm not mad at them. They're kids. I keep saying, where are the parents? It's the parents' responsibility."
Yes.
So that from the wife of the victim was very generous.
Oh, absolutely, very generous. But I mean, I think this is always a tension in this discussion, is the idea of the responsibilities of the parents and whether they, whether they are somehow responsible. And it comes back to, we've talked about, these parents in the United States who are being charged with the offences along with their kids for allowing their kids to have guns.
Yes.
It's an interesting area. I don't exactly know where I fall on it, but I think there's arguments on both sides.
Yeah. Then another very high profile case, Emma Lovell, who was stabbed in the heart in front of her house in Brisbane on Boxing Day after a violent home invasion. So
in front of her house?
Yeah, the teenager who killed her and stabbed her husband. Well, so they were at the front door, I think, and they got stabbed. And she died in the front yard while her family were watching.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the teenager who killed her had been on a 3-day bender.
Wow.
When he entered that house.
On alcohol, drugs? What kind of a bender?
It just said bender.
Right, okay.
And he got 14 years for that offence.
Sorry, how old was he?
He was older. He wasn't under... Oh, he was 17 at the time of the offending.
Right, okay.
The judge, Justice Sullivan, said it was a particularly heinous crime which justified the greater than 10-year sentence. He had a chaotic upbringing, was what his defence barrister said, Scott Lynch. At just 10 years old, he left his mother's house because he'd been exposed to violence and excessive use of alcohol. He went to live with his auntie and uncle, and his mother would call him infrequently but never visit. The only real nurturing and love and stability he experienced came from his grandmother, but they would only speak on the phone. The grandmother's death sent him into a downward spiral, and during that time he became inseparable with another boy. Months before the murder he committed, his friend killed himself, and this teen discovered the body in the backyard. He did have a lengthy criminal history, with 84 convictions recorded across a period of 2.5 years, including the unlawful entry of a premises on 16 occasions. So a real recidivist at a very young age. But his lawyer, Mr. Lynch, told the court there were no previous offences of violence, and this was the first time he'd ever entered a house while armed. He really made the most of that.
Wow.
And he was on probation at the time of committing this offence, with a condition that he go to 45-minute sessions each week with a caseworker, but apparently he received very little nurturing during the sessions.
Well, I suppose it's not really the caseworker's role to be nurturing, but I mean, just to, he obviously doesn't know much about stabbing. Why you would stab someone in the chest is just beyond me, because you're going to get them in the heart. Yeah. Probably.
So obviously that was like one of the more famous triggers for reform to juvenile offending.
What was the reform that came out of that?
Well, the first thing was the breach of bail was confirmed, but then that they were also going to be looking at the Youth Justice Act and considering how best to deal with it. And then we've had things like the announcement of a new prison being a new detention centre. We've had the changes to being able to hold kids in watch houses. There's been a lot of incremental changes that I think are reactions to public outcry, which I understand the public outcry, but then I also question if they're the right choices for dealing with it.
They're absolutely the wrong choices.
His co-accused is yet to be dealt with, I think, in that case. Then January 2023, we had a case of David Connolly. He was 43 years old. He was stabbed to death less than a kilometre from his home in the upmarket in a Brisbane suburb of Wilston.
Jeepers.
He was found collapsed in the early hours on Newmarket Road with critical injuries. He died at the scene, and a 17-year-old boy, again, was charged with murder. He was running along Newmarket Road near the crime scene when he was intercepted 2 hours before the discovery of the victim's body, and he had a knife close to 45 centimetres long in a sheath.
45 centimetre long knife.
They described it as almost a small machete.
Oh, my Lord.
So that was that one. Then we had an Uber driver in Hervey Bay, Scott Cabri, 2023. He was killed by 2 teens. They were 17 at the time. We had 3 innocent women who were killed in April 2023. They were involved in a crash with a 13-year-old who was allegedly driving a stolen vehicle. The 13-year-old did enter a guilty plea, and he was charged with 2 counts of unlawful use of a motor vehicle, 1 count of dangerous operation causing death and grievous bodily harm. So
it doesn't sound like there's many 10 to 14-year-olds committing these offences.
No, not so many. We do have the case in February 2024 of Vilene White. You would remember this one. That was the grandmother in
the
Red
car
Bank.
park at Red Bank. Yeah, that kid was 16, though, wasn't he?
So there was a 16-year-old charged with the stabbing, but there was 5 teenage boys who were arrested in relation to offences together at that time.
Well, they were stealing stuff from cars in the car park or something, weren't they?
They killed her for her car. They wanted to steal her car, and her little granddaughter was right there watching it all happen. And so as a result of that, Vilene's law has been proposed. And this would give judges the power to hand down tougher sentences, the power to refuse bail, and to develop a national crime intervention framework aimed at getting to the root cause of youth crime and building safer communities.
What? What does that mean?
I don't know. But that was the suggestion.
Okay.
Then this year, a 12-year-old girl became one of the youngest people ever to face a murder charge.
No.
Really sad case though. So she was arrested in Victoria after a 37-year-old woman was found dead in her home. The girl had gone missing from state care almost a fortnight earlier and was significantly substance affected. She had run away from state care 275 times in 3 years.
Jeepers.
There had been 10 reports of violent behaviour in the years leading up to this particular victim's death. And those reports included holding up a shop with a knife, carrying a knife in public, assaulting 3 people on separate occasions, stealing her carer's car, throwing a stone through a window. She had a history of abuse and would regularly go missing from her care facilities, had been allegedly the victim of sexual exploitation by adults, was drinking alcohol at the age of 12.
Jeepers.
She was charged. The court was asked to revoke her bail in December 2023, citing concerns with keeping her and other children safe. So, yes, a 12-year-old who committed a murder, but you look at her history.
Yeah.
What chance did she have? Anyway.
So what was the murder? Was it a home invasion and gone wrong or something? So it was a stranger to her. No, it wasn't sort of somebody she knew.
I don't know. It was just in a home.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, yes, you're right. Not a lot of those are committed by kids under 14. But I think what we can see with the kids who are over 14 committing these types of heinous offences is that they're not new offences. They're not new offenders.
No.
They have been in the system for a long time. For
That's
the
pretty
most
similar
part.
to adults though.
Well, it is. But so this is the question, isn't it? Like, how do we stop that cycle? How do we get to these kids before they become the 17-year-old murderer? You know? So raising the age of criminal responsibility, there are lots of arguments for and against. And we've talked about, Dolly and Capax briefly, but for a kid who's aged between 10 and 14 to face criminal charges, the court has to be satisfied that they appreciated that what they did was wrong. So it's up to the prosecution to prove that they should face charges because they had the moral culpability.
And that, in an evidentiary sense, is achieved by the prosecution having a psychiatrist or psychologist interview the child and ask them a series of questions, isn't it?
I think it's at that point now, but there were definitely cases from earlier where a judge could ask questions and satisfy themselves as to that particular issue. There was another case of 2 boys, very young, I think aged 12 and 13, who were charged with rape. It was of a school mate. And the way that the prosecution proved they understood what they did was wrong was because of a conversation they had with the principal when they were interviewed. And so it didn't seem like a really hard threshold to meet, you know. There have been reviews of this idea of the minimum age of criminal responsibility. In August 2023, the Northern Territory raised the age from 10 to 12. In May 2023, the Australian Capital Territory introduced legislation to raise the age to 12 initially. So that was implemented November 2023 with the goal or the intention that it would change to 14 within the next 2 years, so mid-2025. In April 2023, Victoria made an announcement to raise the criminal age of responsibility to 12 by the end of this year and to 14 in 2027. Tasmania in June 2022 committed to raising the age of criminal detention from 10 to 14 years. But then in September 2023, there was a commission of inquiry into the Tasmanian government's responses to child sexual abuse. And it recommended the government work towards increasing the minimum age of detention, which is different, to 16 years by developing alternatives to detention for children aged 14 and 15. So even extrapolating further, that even if you are criminally responsible at age 14, you can't be sent to detention until you're 16.
Yeah.
Bills have been introduced in both New South Wales and Queensland proposing raising the age, but have failed in both of those states. There's definitely movement here, but what does it actually mean if we do that, if we change that minimum age of criminal responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, I can't help thinking that a lot of this is political, because all of the states, or with the exception of Tasmania, whose political situation I'm not entirely familiar with, that you named are all Labor Party states. It's Northern Territory's Labor Party's just been voted out in a landslide. The ACT Labor Party's been in forever, and the Victorian Labor Party's been in for quite a long time, and they're all pushing this as part of their political agenda. And I think that really muddies the waters in terms of you and me, lawyers, sitting down and thinking, is this the right thing to do? Because I'm not sure if the people in these governments are thinking that way. I think they're just thinking, we need to get votes. This is a vote winner. Let's put this in.
And you think about headlines recently, David Crisafulli, for example, who's saying adult crime, adult time. Yeah, so. And I just think that, I mean, I'm not a political person. I don't have a preference really for politics. But Stephen Miles, I think, was quoted as saying it's a 4-word soundbite. And I think that's right.
It is absolutely a 4-word soundbite.
What does that even mean? But then I was thinking, okay, but so if we are going to increase the age of criminal responsibility and we still have kids under the age of 14 committing heinous crimes, what happens then? And I thought of the most heinous crime committed by young children ever, which you would remember, which was the murder of James Bulger in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I thought I would just talk briefly about this case because it is one that stays in the consciousness because the offenders in that case were 10 years old.
Yeah.
Both of them.
It's unbelievable, that case.
And the victim was...
he was 8 or something.
2.
Yeah. Oh, so he was 2.
2-year-old. The victim was 2 years old. So this happened in England in 1993.
Yeah.
So the little boy, James, was at the local shops with his mum, Denise. They were in the butcher's. She was placing an order. She took her eyes off James literally for a second, and when she turned back, he was gone.
Yeah.
It took 91 seconds, they later worked out, for these 2 10-year-olds, they're called John Venables and Robert Thompson, to take James by the hand and take him out of the shopping centre. And then they began to walk across, some fields or whatever, towards a railway line where these 2 10-year-olds had a little den they had set up in an embankment there. Now, amazingly, they were seen by 38 people as they walked with the 2-year-old to their den, most of whom did nothing, I guess thinking what possible harm could 2 10-year-olds, 2 little boys, be doing to this other little
But you'd
boy.
assume that they were sort of related or something.
That's right. That was the assumption, that he was their little brother. And there's this real, it really strikes a chord, this image that they took from CCTV footage of the 2 10-year-olds with one of them holding James's hand. And he was so trusting, But then they get to the railway line and they bludgeoned little baby James with weapons, including a 22-pound iron bar. And then they left him wearing his little Noddy T-shirt, just left him on the train tracks.
Yeah.
He was missing for 2 days before they found him.
Yeah.
The 2 10-year-olds were questioned on the 18th. So this was like a matter of days. He went missing on the 12th. So they were questioning both of them on the 18th. They were the youngest murder suspects those police had ever dealt with. They asked the boys specific questions to establish if they understood the difference between right and wrong, the implications of telling the truth or a lie, and both passed that test to the satisfaction of the police. John Venables eventually confessed on the 19th, so the next day. Thompson did not confess, but he had made certain statements that were against his interest and could be used against him. And so both were charged with murder on the 20th of February, 93. They were convicted after a trial of murder. So they were that was the successful charge. And they were sentenced to 8 years imprisonment each. Remembering by the time they were convicted, I think they were 11.
Yes.
The jury were instructed that they needed to believe that both boys understood the seriousness of their crime in order to convict them. The dock in the courtroom had to be altered so that the boys could see over it. Like they were so – you look at the photos of those two little boys as well. They were also babies.
Yeah.
Like you look at them, 10, they're so little. I read some of the things they were saying in interview and like they left him on the train track in the hope that a train would run over him so he wouldn't be identified. Like there was real evil at play there.
Yeah.
In 2001, after they served their 8 years, they were both released. They were given new identities. They were moved to different parts of the country. In 2010, Venables, under his new name, was age 27 by that time, and he ended up going to jail again because he had downloaded and distributed indecent images of children. He was released on parole in 2013, again imprisoned in 2017 when more child abuse images and a pedophile manual were found on his computer. He was denied parole in December 2023 as he was considered to be a continuing threat to children and could offend again. So he's still in prison. Thompson, on the other hand, has not been heard of. He kept a low profile and, as far as we know, did not ever offend again. And so a couple of things that come out of that case for me are, firstly, if the minimum age of criminal responsibility was 14, what would have happened in terms of justice for James? You know? And then secondly, for those people who say you're ruining the entire life of a child if you send them to jail, well, these are two boys who committed the same crime. One of them rehabilitated and the other didn't. So it's not necessarily a life sentence. You know?
No, sure.
What do you think?
Well, but they weren't put in a proper jail, were they? They were put in sort of a special facility.
Yeah, detained.
Detained, yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'd like to know a bit more about that case, have some question marks over it. But I mean, again, the calculated nature of it, you know, you just wonder.
Well, and James wasn't the first child they tried to take that day.
Wow.
So there was a little girl who they tried to take, but either the mum noticed or she called out or something.
Wow.
And so they were unsuccessful. So there was deliberateness to their conduct. I guess the question I ask, well, what would happen in terms of justice for a victim like James if there was no criminal responsibility under 14? The New South Wales Attorney General, surname Speakman, I think, said after a meeting with the Council of Attorneys General, if there is a move to raise the age of criminal responsibility, you have to identify what is the alternative for children who would otherwise be subject to this criminal justice process. And I think what gets lost in the arguments for raising the age is the rights of the victims. You know, like if we're saying no, they're too young to be held responsible, what does that say about how we value victims' rights and their place in the criminal justice system? Because if the kid can't be held responsible, are we going to be charging the parents? Is that fair? Can that happen? You know, so it just means the victims are left with...
I don't really know what is the victim's place in our criminal justice system. They're not a party. They're witnesses.
They're not a party, but
they can do victim impact statements.
No, the criminal justice system has to balance the rights of the victim as well.
Why does it have to do that? Where does it say that? You take it into account on sentence? I think that's it, isn't it?
How can you say a victim doesn't have a part in the criminal justice system?
Well, you tell me what part they have.
Well, without a victim, there is no proceeding.
Well, so they're a witness. Yeah, but they make the complaint to the police. The police bring it. They're a witness.
They're more important than a witness if they're the complainant.
Well, they're a very central witness.
Okay, well, they definitely have a part.
But what is it? Where is it? What is it in the legislation? I mean, I'm just trying to think of it. I know that it's in legislation in the sentencing procedures. They get to, you have to take into account the effect on the victim, and they can do victim impact statements. And that's all post conviction, which I think is very appropriate. I've done a bit of stuff in international criminal law, which is based a lot on European notions of justice, which I think is an oxymoron sometimes, and. The victims have a role in those trials, and I just think that is so problematic. And so I'm just not sure. When you say the victims' rights, I mean, what are the victims' rights? I'm not sure they've got any more rights than anyone else.
I think they do. I can't remember exactly where I got it from, but I know that in my
they're all
introduction to criminal law, I would say that when we're looking at the criminal justice system and the right for an accused to have a fair trial, and that has to be of paramount concern for the courts, we are still balancing the rights of the victims as well.
Why do you say that part?
Well, I must have got it from somewhere. I don't just make stuff
this
up.
is the problem. These things appear in policy documents in the police and the prosecution services.
Okay.
They're not, and policy documents they're not voted on by people. They're written by policy people, and they're often informed by politics, not by anything else. And so there's all this stuff about victims' rights. Like, well, where's that in the law?
Okay, but so let me ask you a different question then. Why shouldn't the rights of victims be a consideration for the criminal justice system?
Well, I'm not saying. Well, like on sentence, absolutely.
No.
But prior to when working out whether somebody is guilty or innocent, I think it's incredibly problematic taking the victims in any other way than as a witness. And this whole idea of rights of the victims, like what rights of the victims? They're a witness. That's all they are.
Have you ever been a victim of crime?
I have been a victim of crime, yes. And I had no problems with having nothing to do with any of it.
Such a defense lawyer. Yeah. My God. Then I thought, okay, let's come back to these headlines we're reading, you know, dealing with the youth crime and what's the government going to do, and we've got this youth crime crisis and all of that sort of thing. And I looked at a lot of statistics, which I know you would love.
Yep.
But is youth crime actually increasing in Queensland? Well, the answer is yes. Okay. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics recorded crime data in December 2023 showed the number of young criminals in Queensland has increased 6%.
The number of young criminals, okay.
To 10,878 offenders in that last year.
Right, okay.
The rates of youth crime accounting for population growth also showed the offender rate increased from 1,863 offenders per 100,000 people to 1,925. So not exponential growth, but definitely an increase. And the number of juvenile serious repeat offenders in Queensland also increased from 465 to 482. So again, not massive increase, but an increase.
Yep.
What crime is most common in youth? According again to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, violent offences or acts intended to cause injury accounted for 23% of juvenile crimes in that
Acts intended to cause injury. What is that? It would be nice if the Australian Bureau of Statistics wouldn't make up their own categories, but would just use the existing categories we all understood what they were talking about.
But so for those who say that young offenders are mostly committing property offending, I mean, that's almost a quarter of young offenders committing violent crimes.
Yeah. What I think the problem is policing, because the greatest deterrent to committing crime is the likelihood of getting caught. We talk about deterrence all the time on the podcast in terms of sentencing, because that's really where lawyers deal with this idea of deterrence. You know, when a person's been convicted, they're being sentenced, and, you know, if you punish them, the rule of thumb, the bigger the punishment, the less likely they are to do it again, and the more that sends a message to everyone else not to do the same thing.
Which I think isn't true.
Yeah. But what we don't talk about, because we're not at that end of the spectrum, is that in fact the greatest deterrent is the likelihood of getting caught. Because if you're likely of getting caught, you're not going to commit the crime. And so it's a policing problem. And I mean, in Queensland, we have particular problems in the Queensland Police at the moment, terrible cultural problems. They can't retain staff. They did a huge, restructure, which was a complete failure. All of their stats are just terrible in terms of getting worse in terms of clearance rates and blah, 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 blah. And so the problem in Queensland is policing. It is about the fact that the organisation is being badly run and has a terrible, culture, and so they're not catching criminals. And so the kids are out there doing this because the likelihood of getting caught is less than it was.
Well, and I think obviously there must be some truth to that. And oh gosh, I look at these young kids who are doing things, like the rise of social media.
Oh yeah.
Like the number of young offenders who film themselves committing crimes and posting it on social media. Like seriously.
But I mean, that's, they're hoisting themselves by their own petard because the police are then getting that and using it as evidence against them.
But the other thing I was going to say is, yes, there are obviously some policing issues, but I know from personal connections that when young kids are being caught by police, there's this approach where they are given a warning. Like they sit down with the police and they say, if you do this again, and the kids don't give a hoot about that. No. It makes no difference to them. And so they continue on their merry way. But it's this idea of giving them a chance to not be brought into the system immediately. And so I just think we do need a different
You think
approach.
Zero tolerance policing, that as soon as they're caught for anything
No, I think we need a different approach. Like I think it shouldn't be either you're in the criminal justice system or you're given a warning. I think don't necessarily have detention as the option and court processes, but we need something to fill that gap. Like these are kids obviously for the most part who need support.
Yes.
At my core,
yes,
I believe that. I look at these 10, 11, 12-year-olds out committing these crimes and I as a parent think, why are they out? What are they doing?
Yeah.
And I know that kids are hard to control and I know that there are so many different family circumstances that can make it difficult. But we also as parents have phenomenal tools like tracking, Find My Phone or Life 360 or, so anyway, so what I thought was just before we finish off.
Yep.
I think we are making some big mistakes when it comes to dealing with kids. And one of the biggest things is this idea of kids being held in watch houses.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So in January 2024, there was a report from the media that said this is about Cairns. The padded cells at the Cairns Police Watch House have walls like concrete. The floor slopes down to a grate at the front that an officer says collects urine, blood, whatever, that goes slowly towards the drain. A CCTV image obtained by Guardian Australia offers a rare glimpse into the sorts of rooms being used to hold children in Queensland watch houses, where they are kept indefinitely, sometimes for several weeks, waiting for a bed in the overcrowded youth detention system. So this change to allow children to be held in watch houses, which are traditionally for adult offenders.
And only on a temporary basis. They're not set up to stay there long term,
The violent detention cell in Cairns has no toilet or running water, and sources say it has been used to hold some of the most vulnerable children in the lockup, including those with intellectual disabilities or exhibiting mental illness who become distressed and violent during long periods inside.
And also you can't put them in with other with adult offenders.
No.
You've got to put them in by themselves.
So then
or with
they're in
other kids.
isolation.
Yeah.
So a senior psychologist sent a cry for help letter detailing horrendous conditions and alleged human rights abuses in the Cairns lockup. And she said, in all my years and experience working in government, NGOs and private practice, I have never witnessed the horrors we are currently expected to manage.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I just think that was a crucial error to allow kids to be held in watch houses.
But again, part of the problem is parole for adults. I mean, there is a lot, if they were better at letting people out on parole, we wouldn't have the kind of backlog we have. So I heard a statistic recently, I don't know how accurate it is, that there are 250 prisoners who have been granted parole but aren't allowed out of jail because the parole board hasn't approved the address that they've given that they're going to live at. 250 prisoners is basically a whole jail.
That's a lot.
You could immediately free up a whole jail if you just, were a bit better on, approving addresses
So
or
is that
something.
because they don't have the manpower to check the addresses?
Well, this is my personal opinion, that I don't have anything to back this up except my lived experience, and that is that the parole board is being far too strict on this, because they don't want somebody on parole committing offences and then being on the front page of the Courier Mail and then questions being asked about how they got parole.
Which is fair, Joe.
No, you cannot run a society based on fear of what the local media are going to say.
Sorry, I think it's fair they don't want to release someone on parole if there's a chance.
There's always a chance that someone on parole is going to commit. You can never stop that. I mean, that's just an opportunity cost. But as I say, an entire jail could be emptied in the state of Queensland right now if they just went, yep, whatever parole address you give us is fine, see you later. 250 prisoners would walk out the door right now.
So the government would say they're addressing that by building a new detention centre.
We wouldn't need to build one, because we could have one of the ones that
I don't think that's even the answer. I don't think finding places for these kids is the answer.
No.
So
well,
then...
I think part of the problem is that places like Boys Town, the Outer Bay Desert, have been closed down. And I appreciate that, the institutional abuse that occurred in some of these places, has been identified, and that there are people who went to those institutions who were, victims of horrible offences. I totally accept all of that. But I think that we've lost, we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater to some extent, because the closing down of these places meant that that institutions that were set up to deal with troubled kids, not in a jail environment, but in a stricter environment, really don't exist anymore. So it's very, it's either they're out in the community or they're in a jail, and we don't have that sort of middle of the road option.
Yes, so that's what I was looking at.
Yep.
So, I mean, the other thing I just wanted to flag is that rates of recidivism after detention in a youth facility are huge.
Yep.
So in terms of a way of dealing with a young offender where rehabilitation should be a goal, because for everyone in society, it's better if that child does not commit further offences.
Yes, correct.
Detention is not working there. Let me tell you, the percentage of young people who reoffended within 12 months of being released from Queensland youth detention centres was between 84 and 96% in 2023.
Wow.
So that is failing on every level.
Absolutely, isn't it?
And so then I thought, okay, well, what do we do then?
Yeah.
If we're not going to send them to detention. I don't want to just say the government's wrong and not come up with some kind of suggestion.
Yep.
So in New Zealand, they have a program that is like a military camp.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay. So they're called MACs, military style activity camps.
Oh.
And they're run by the New Zealand Defence Force.
Oh, okay.
At the moment, so this was 2009. Sorry, this came in. It was for 40 of the most serious recidivist youth offenders.
Wow.
There were concerns with the way it was being run. So June 30, I read an article that the youth offender boot camps in New Zealand, run by the New Zealand Defence Force, said that military-style training does not work for complex participants.
No.
And has resulted in serious mental and physical harm of defence personnel.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, jeepers.
But that was one idea. We've got the On Country program, which was established in 2019 as a 3-year trial in Townsville, Cairns and Mount Isa. So On Country is an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-led program providing cultural-based rehabilitation for First Nations young people. And let's just flag here that there is a massive overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in detention. So we certainly need to keep that at the forefront of any kind of alternative. But it is showing some really good progress, and expressions of interest for a new intensive on-country trial opened in February of this year. So organisations could make an expression of interest to provide property or a program under that on-country initiative. Okay. So that could be something that could also be adapted for non-Indigenous offenders.
Interesting.
Victoria, July 2024, young people are being urged to anonymously report their friends.
I can't believe that. That is just, it's like the Stasi in East Berlin. It's just a revolting idea.
It actually says they're being urged to dob in their mates who brag and post online about committing violent crimes in a desperate attempt to thwart the youth crime crisis.
Well, that should just be police monitoring Facebook a bit more.
That's an alternative for them. I think that might have been, because we did have boot camps in Queensland.
Yeah.
And they were not successful.
Okay.
That was 2013. There was a boot camp trial for convicted children to be sentenced by a court to spend a month in a remote location.
Wow, okay.
It immediately ran into problems with far fewer children sentenced to the orders than initially anticipated. Then they were made mandatory for some children who were repeatedly convicted of stealing a car. And it was closed by the Palaszczuk government in 2015 after a cost blowout. So it doesn't say it wasn't effective at rehabilitation. It just was not implemented well.
No.
So I obviously, the answer is complex. I don't have the answer, but I just can't help thinking, and of course I have so much empathy for victims of juvenile offending. And I know that there are some just really bad kids who will do what they want regardless. But I think if we look at it, the majority of child offenders have had a tough time.
Absolutely.
They need support rather than detention. I don't think changing the age of criminal responsibility is the answer.
No.
Perhaps we could make it that for children under 14 committing minor offences, a different process happens. But I think if they're going to be committing crimes like James Bulger's murder or the ones that I talked about earlier at a young age, they have to be held responsible for those.
Yeah. I think the problem with the argument, which is what you pointed out earlier, is there's often a conflation between raising the age and the punishment that children get and the complaints about holding them in watch houses. And they're two separate issues.
They are two separate issues. And it's hard to divorce it because it all gets reported together.
Yes.
But I think we keep the age of criminal responsibility, but we find better ways to intervene with these very young offenders, unless they're very serious offences.
Absolutely,
you know, that's my thought process.
Well, I think you're exactly right, but I think also there's wider issues in terms of policing and getting policing right, because kids and adults are not going to commit offences if they think they're going to get caught. Why would you? Yeah. So we need to improve the policing, and that'll improve the youth crime problem. And I think we need to improve parole in this state.
And I think we need to get rid of drugs.
I
think that's a huge part of it.
Huge issue, drugs in society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know, Joe. I feel like it doesn't really resolve anything, but maybe awareness, discussion.
Yeah, I think that always helps. And we're probably going to get a bit more of it in Queensland in the lead up to the election.
Which is nearly upon us.
I know. And the problem is it becomes political, and then that muddies the waters so much.
Yeah. Anyway.
Lovely.
That's
all right.
it.
Thanks, Lizzie. That was awesome.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please rate and review or like and subscribe. It all helps Lizzie and I keep this podcast going. If you're interested in clips, you can look at them on Instagram and TikTok. Just search for Justice Matters Pod. See you next episode.